Now what I have drawn for you here is the cycle of life. And the cycle of life is the cycle that takes matter, it breaks it down through these stages, and it brings the matter back to dust. And isn't that why we have compost bins? So the one I'm adding to, I'm putting scraps from the kitchen, I'm putting weeds from the garden, and maybe if we've got chooks, or you call it chickens, is that right? We call the babies chickens and the adults chooks. I'll say chickens, then you know what I mean. So if you've got chickens, you might scrape the chook yard, or you call it a chicken, and put that on, and the farmer down the road, you might put some of the manure from his cows into the compost bin, and you layer it. And the one that's sitting, I'm waiting for these microorganisms to bring matter back to dust. And then the third compost bin, I know it's ready to put in my garden because tomato plants are coming up, pumpkin plants are coming up. And I've got a photograph of me in my compost bin, not those other two, they can get a bit smelly. But the one I'm taking from, I'm squatting down and I've got a handful of it. Smells like earth. It's ready to go into my garden. And when I put it into my garden, what am I putting into my garden? I'm putting microorganisms. You see, a basic law of science states nothing's created, nothing's destroyed. It just changes form. It's called the cycle of life, or the carbon cycle. And the basic law of science states nothing's created and nothing's destroyed. It just changes form. This is imperative. Understanding the cycle of life, or the carbon cycle, it's imperative to understand that so that we know the true role of these microorganisms in disease. And something that's rarely asked as virus are out of control, the mold, what should we be asking? Why? Why? And Newton's third law of motion states that to every action there's an equal and an opposite reaction. And the Bible says in Proverbs 26 verse 2, the curse causeless shall not come. In other words, no curse, no problem, no disease, nothing of any concern happens without a cause. There's always a cause. And one of my first health books was The Ministry of Healing. And I know they have some available out there. And there's a chapter called The Physician, the Educator. Did you hear that? Did you know that's what physician means? Educator. And unfortunately today, because of Medicare in Australia, I think Obamacare here, doctors are only allowed to spend 15 minutes per person. And how much are they going to learn in 15 minutes? And that's why I believe that we should be our own doctor. What we are today, because of all that, because of everything that's happened in our past. And I remember I was at a retreat in London a few years ago, and a lady came to me every day. She'd come and she said, Barbara, I've just remembered something else. She said, when I was 3, I fell off the tractor. That's another piece. That's another piece in the equation. And that's why it's good to go, and if Mum and Dad are still alive, Mum, what was my birth like? What did you feed me? Did I get the shot? Did I react? And by the way, if there's a fever or if the child is crying for hours, that's a reaction. And that, of course, we can't change what happened in the past, but it explains. It explains so much as to why these things are so. Rudyard Kipling, famous poet, he wrote a whole poem on this, and I'll just give you the first stanza. He said, I have 6 trusty serving men. They taught me all I know. Their names are what, why, when, where, how, and who. Do you have your 6 trusty serving men? Do you take them everywhere you go? And if you're a health professional and you're asking a lot of questions, and I hope you don't go in unless you've got a whole page of them, because you're employing them to do you a service. And if they get annoyed at your questions, arise, politely excuse yourself, and leave and don't pay the bill. Have you ever been to a doctor that will not listen to you? That's very frustrating. Don't be that doctor. If the body says stop, what should you do? We're not very good at that, are we? Because if you don't listen to the first whisper, the body will start screaming. And if it starts screaming, it's doing damage. So please, that's an important part of being your own doctor, is investigating why these things are so, and listening. So let's go back to the compost bins, which explains so much in the cycle of life. And I'm going to show you what I do with my, it's the right colour, isn't it? This is a plant from my garden. And underneath the ground there are roots. And I dig up my compost and I put it into my garden. In fact, before I put another crop in, I always feed the soil, because the previous crop took a lot of nutrients out of the soil, and you should not put another crop in there until you've fed the soil. And when I put the compost into the soil, what am I putting into the soil? I'm putting microorganisms. Now these microorganisms, they are now going to play another role. They now are responsible for the breakdown of the minerals in the soil. Aren't you glad we don't have to eat dirt to get minerals? We couldn't get them anyway. A lady came here one day, she said, "Barb, I've got a terrible story for you, and I'm so embarrassed to even tell you." She said, "Little 10-month-old baby ate some dog droppings." Isn't that what they do? I said, "Don't worry about it, it's going to go in one end and out the other. And we're going to look at that process tomorrow. We're going to start up here and end at the other end. And you will discover that the gastrointestinal tract is a hollow tube. The thing that goes in that hollow tube is not part of you or me until it gets broken down to tiny substances, absorbed out of the gut and into the blood. Then it becomes part of you or me. And I said, well, it's not something we'd really like our babies to eat, but don't worry about it. It's going in and it'll come out the other end. Same with dirt. And how many little ones will get their fingers and eat dirt? And my daughter, one of her babies, used to do that all the time. She'd put her on the grass to play and she'd get her little finger and eat the dirt. And the next day when she changed the nappy, I think you call it a diaper, guess what's in the nappy? Dirt. No, there is another way, and an incredible way for us to get our minerals. And it's these microorganisms. These microorganisms are responsible for the breakdown of the minerals in the soil, and then they are responsible for the absorption of the minerals into the plant. So I'm very glad that I did have a green there, because plant blood is green. Also, these microorganisms play a protective role, protecting the plant from any harmful pathogens that might be in the soil, and these microorganisms are also responsible for the nourishment of the plant. And that plant knows that it needs those microorganisms. So into the fuel that it makes from photosynthesis, it sends back down to the roots to feed the microorganisms. Beautiful illustration of the law of service that is written on every plant in nature. Have you noticed every plant takes with one purpose? To give. To give. Usually to you and me, to give. Actually, not the enemy. If they're about, we should be asking why. Now I'm going to attempt to move my board onto another one. Oh, how did I do that? Help. Maybe here. never have taken these microorganisms before, although this area is an area of great interest, and that is the gastrointestinal tract of human beings. And if you notice, they're very, very similar to the roots of the plant. Now, I've got some very exciting news. It's exciting for me. At 8:30 last night, my 4th great-grandchild was born. Now, when that baby was in her mother's womb, her gut was sterile, no microorganisms. But when that baby was born, that baby was literally showered with the mother's microorganisms. In fact, I was watching a documentary on the gut, on microorganisms, and they were interviewing a gynecologist, and he said, we always thought God made a mistake putting the birth canal and the anus so close. He said, to the point, the man was in his 70s, that 50 years ago, if a woman was in labour, we'd always give her an enema. We want to clean that area out. But the perfect design. Because when the birth canal stretches open with the baby coming out, that little canal next door also stretches open, and the air coming out of there is laden with microorganisms in the colon, and the baby goes and swallows, and that's those first gulps start to take those microorganisms into the gut, and a thick turf wall start. My little great-granddaughter, Amelia Esther, is now feeding every few hours off her mother's breast, but there's no milk yet. The milk doesn't come in for 3 days. What she's taking in is a thick, yellowy colostrum, and it's incredibly rich, and I think it's Friday night where we're going to be looking at our immune system. And isn't that the one thing that everyone agreed on in 2020, which is about the only thing, and that was we need to boost our immune system. And you will discover that 70% of our immune system is established by these microorganisms that line the gastrointestinal tract, called our microbiome, our friendly bacteria. These microorganisms in the gastrointestinal tract, they do a very similar thing to what they do in the soil. They form a thick turf wall. Here are the roots of the plants, and there's the microorganisms in the soil, and these are just like the roots of the plant, and these are the microorganisms forming a thick turf wall. That's why it's important for a woman at all possible not to take antibiotics in pregnancy, because the antibiotics kill off, they kill off the good and the bad. In fact, one writer said taking an antibiotic is like dropping an atomic bomb in the gut. What did the atomic bomb do? It killed. These microorganisms lining the gastrointestinal tract, they are responsible for the final breakdown of our food. And as we go on the journey through the gut tomorrow, you will discover that these microorganisms, these microorganisms, they are responsible for the final breakdown of foods. Now, yes, you'll discover there's enzymes all through that are. But these microorganisms, they're releasing something else. They're releasing or affecting the release of our B vitamins. They are also causing the production of melatonin, helps us sleep better at night. Also causing the production of glutathione, which has been hailed as the #1 antioxidant. And it's not something you can eat, it's something's released because of our gut flora. Our gut flora is also responsible for the absorption of our minerals out of our gut and into the blood. These microorganisms are also play a protective role, and we'll be looking at that when we look at the immune system. And they also are responsible for the nourishment. of the cells that line the gastrointestinal tract. We're constantly being remade. These cells that line the gastrointestinal tract, they're remade every 3 to 5 days. So then the question is arise, well, how come someone with irritable bowel, Crohn's disease, colitis, gastritis, why don't they heal in 2 weeks? Is that a reasonable question? It's a very reasonable question, and we'll be looking at that in detail tomorrow night. Crohn's disease, it's been called an autoimmune disease. I have to tell you, I do not believe in autoimmune diseases, because God did not design this body to eat itself. Something has happened. It's time to put this resident Y up here that should be on every single board. And if someone has been diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, I would like to suggest that it's a good idea to reject that diagnosis, because it's an opinion. Did you hear that? It's an opinion. And so if ever you've been diagnosed with that, you say, thank you so much for your advice, I'm going to seriously consider this, and you go home and you do consider it. You see, God said in 2 Timothy 1 verse 7, he said, I've not given you the spirit of fear, but of power. What's power? Isn't knowledge power? Love. Love glues us together, and a sound mind considers the pros and the cons. We should never make a decision because, and I know many people now are sorry, because a lot of people thought maybe this is serious, but I think we all know now it wasn't. My husband calls it the great pretend. Well, let's go back to our subject tonight. So as you can see, my aim is to show you that the microorganisms are not the enemy. They're an important part of life on planet Earth. And one of my favourite heroines is Florence Nightingale. Now, Florence Nightingale, in 1854, she was asked to go to Scutari. So Scutari is the port where the wounded from the Crimean War were being taken. The British and the French were fighting the Russians in Crimea. This is the Black Sea. The wounded were put in boats, sailed down to Scutari. And Scutari is the port where the hospital was. The hospital really was just ex-army Turkish barracks that had been hastily put together because of all the wounded. And a war correspondent went to report on the war effort, and he was shocked at what he saw in that hospital. Men were dying like flies. In fact, the death rate in that hospital was 50%. That's greater than on the battlefront. So he went back to London and he wrote headlines, did we raise our young men to die like this? Well, the British government quickly rose up and asked Florence and 35 nurses to go to Scutari to see what she could do. She was shocked. There was raw sewage in the corridors. She met a man who still was in his battle clothes 2 weeks after he'd been admitted. The doctors were not washing their hands between operations. They'd say, well, we're already covered in blood. And the doctor said to Florence and her nurses, you're not coming in here, this is men's business. So they sent her to the kitchen. Well, in the kitchen there were big vats of water with bits of rotten meat in it. That was their food. I think it's a miracle that the death rate wasn't 80% when you look at the conditions. She knew her limitations as a woman in 1854, so she nearly said email, telegrammed the British government and said, we need a sanitary commission to come and assess this. And she also telegrammed her father. She wanted a shipload of clean linen, clean bandages, scrubbing brushes, and a cook. Meanwhile, another boatload of wounded arrived, 1,200 wounded men, and the hospital was already full. And so the doctor said to Florence and her nurses, all right, you can come in. And she just got them to start scrubbing and cleaning. The sanitary commission arrived, and they discovered that the hospital was built in a swamp. And in the swamp, they found a dead horse. In case you don't know, that's a horse. and that's a dog. Dead horse and dead dog in the swamp, and the men in the hospital were drinking the water.
Yep.
So very quickly the Sanitary Commission assessed it. They got plumbers, they got, started to drain it. They, did all they could. Meanwhile, inside, Florence and her nurses are scrubbing and cleaning, and the clean back food, and within 2 months the death rate went from 50% to 2%.
Oh.
Now we can never forget Florence. Now the man that made the germ theory famous, Louis Pasteur, was a chemist. And when Florence Nightingale read of his theory, she said, "This is the theory of a man of a very unstable mind." And anyone who believes it is equally unstable. Because germs don't cause disease. And all Florence did was she got in there and she started cleaning up the place. She started scrubbing and cleaning. And when she went back to England, 14 months later, there was a big welcoming party there for her because, oh, how they loved her. That was their sons, their grandsons, their nieces, their nephews that were dying in that hospital. And when she saw the welcoming party, there was Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, named to Mary Smith, and went down the back gangplank and went home. And they said to her later, "Why did you do that?" She said, "I'm not a heroine." She said, "All I did was increase hygiene, sanitation, and nutrition." Got that? Hygiene, sanitation, and nutrition. She just turned the tap off. So there was nothing for these microorganisms that I just drew for you that are on the other screen, and I'm actually not quite sure how to get it. But I'm sure your memory serves you well on that. You see, they're not the enemy, and she knew that. How come Florence knew that and the doctors didn't? Well, you might be surprised and you might not be surprised. She read her Bible. And in the little book, The Ministry of Healing, there's a chapter in there called the health regulations that God gave the Israelites. Remember Moses in the desert with millions of people? Do you know there was no sickness? Because there were strict rules of cleanliness. If someone were to go to the bathroom, they had to go outside the camp, dig a hole, and no one was to know they'd been there. Someone died in the camp, and the only death the report was from old age. The body had to be carried out, dug a hole, buried, and the people carrying that dead body could not go back in the camp for 3 days. They had to wash their clothes, they had to wash their bodies. So there's strict cleanliness rules, so there was no disease in the camp. That's how come Florence Nightingale knew. Did you know that in the 1850s all the sewage from London went into the Thames, and the people living in London drank that water? No wonder the Black Plague happened. Yeah. That's why there's no Black Plague anymore, because it was in the late 1850s they built a sewage system under the streets of London. You might have seen photographs from that time where children would be playing in the gutter, in raw sewage and rats. So I'd like to show you a graph. And you'll see all the childhood illnesses from that time: mumps, measles, rubella, polio, whooping cough, tetanus, diphtheria. And you will find there's a drop in all these diseases. Why? Because of Florence Nightingale. Hygiene, that's first keep the body clean, wash it every day, put clean clothes on every day. Sanitation, keep the house clean, sweep the floor, empty the trash can every day, scrub your bathroom every week. And nutrition. So that's all she did. That's what increased nutrition. And that's why we had a drop in those childhood illnesses, and in some cases 80% wiped out, sometimes 90% wiped out, and that green shows when the childhood shots were introduced. And what are we told? We're told they caused the decrease, but it is not true. and epilepsy, autism. What caused that? The neurotoxins that are in lead. These graphs have been taken out of the medical journals, but there are several books that are showing these graphs. And that's why if someone says to me, should I give my child the shots? I said, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You need to investigate. Now the Bible says in Psalm 146 verse 3, put not your trust in princes. Who are the princes? The authorities in the field, authorities in government, authorities in nutrition, authorities in medicine, authorities in any field. It doesn't mean you don't go to them, it doesn't mean you get their advice. But what can you do with that advice? You can take it or leave it. You see, God's government is a government of freedom, and freedom is based on free choice. I am the master of my destiny. I'm the one that chooses what I do and what I do not do to my body. Don't let anyone take that right away from you. It is your God-given right to say, no, thank you. I'm not against doctors. Some of my best friends are doctors. And surgery's come a long way, absolutely. But when I broke my arm, my radius, total break out of alignment, just a little bit over a year ago, walking on the rocks with my grandchildren, walking along, and I didn't realise in this big flat rock there was a bit of a dip, and there had been water and it recently dried. So I put my foot there, whole body went up, slammed down. Very, very painful. Told me there was something seriously wrong, and the lifesaver came running over, and when she looked at the arm, she said, you go straight to the hospital, because it was a really weird look. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I'm in hospital waiting to be seen, and I'm so glad God doesn't show you the future. I sat there for 6 hours in the most excruciating pain, waiting to see the orthopedic surgeon. Why did I sit there? Because the whole system is chocked up with people that have got a sore finger, a sore knee, my blood pressure's gone up, my heart's racing. I feel sick, and the nurse said, have you had anything to drink today? Oh, not much. And I'm sitting there thinking, I can't believe this. I could fix them, I could fix them, I could fix them. Yeah. And you know, I sat there and I thought, they reckon we're an enlightened age. I think we're a dumb age. We don't even know how to look after our bodies. These are simple little things that could easily be fixed. And I am also very thankful for the skill of the orthopedic surgeon that pulled my radius back into place. And I'm so thankful for the pain-killing medication so I didn't feel him pull it back into place. Absolutely, in a crisis, a drug can be necessary. So we're not talking about that. But we're talking about every little bits and pieces. And I sat there thinking, now I know why I do what I do. To teach people how to look after their own bodies with the simple, natural treatments. Now, before the Australian government saw fit to ban me, because I'll leave it up to you to work out this week whether I'm a threat to public safety, but before the government saw fit to ban me, there used to be several doctors in Australia. They get me to go to their town to give these meetings because they knew that if people knew these simple ways to look after the body, then that would reduce casualty. And the poor doctors and nurses are run off their feet because people don't know how to get a splinter out. They don't know how to fix a sore toe. They don't know how to calm themselves when they've got a... And isn't this the most neglected area of education? And in that little book, The Ministry of Healing, in the chapter, The Physician, the Educator, on the second page, only hope of better things is the education of people in the right principles. And then it says, let the physicians teach the people that restorative power lies not in drugs, but in nature. Amen. thing that has the ability to heal us, and that is this body. And you will discover this week, as we go through different parts of this body and different ailments, that everything we need, we actually have got. It's inside of us. So there are two basic systems of healing today. One's based on fear. And this system that's based on fear is based on a theory that we evolved. And because we evolved, we cannot heal. And because we cannot heal, then a whole $1 billion in to produce drugs. Drugs never heal disease. They just change the form and location. An orthopedic surgeon said to me, Barbara, I can set a bone, but I cannot heal a bone. That's true. You can set a bone, but you cannot heal it. And this system was based on deception. What's deception? Not as it seems. Another system is based on faith. And the Bible verse for faith is found in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. It's the evidence of things not seen. It was the longest 6 weeks of my life. But have you noticed it healed? It healed. What an incredible body we have. That's based on faith. And it's based on the fact that we were created in the image of God, and we were created with an inbuilt ability to heal. And if you get a cut, it heals, doesn't it? Unless you keep pulling it open. But it'll heal. And you know, there's been a death and no one attended the funeral because no one knew he died. It was the death of common sense. There's a bit of common sense there. It's like I was talking to this guy. He said, oh, there's sun today, so I ran out. And I got so burned. I said, where's your common sense, mate? If you haven't had well, and you lie there for an hour, you're going to be burned. Now, that's not rocket science, is it? Part of being your own doctor is some common sense. We were created to heal, but sometimes we might need a bit of help. And that's where God gave us herbs. And in Psalm 104, verse 14, the Bible says God gave herbs for the service of man. I love that verse because the herbs come in to serve you. Where do you want me? What would you like me to do? Medicine calls it synergism, working with the needs of the body. You see, if the human body was designed to heal itself, and the crescendo on Friday night will be the immune system where you will see we have everything we need to heal. If the human body was designed to heal itself, doesn't it make the most sense that to bring about healing in the body is you work with that? You work with that process? So herbs come into your body to serve you. And what I tell you here is the truth. Drugs are like robots. Get out of my way, I've got a job to do whether you need it or not. You're still on the blood thinning medication. And that's why one guy came to us and his doctor took him off everything because his blood pressure had gone down, and if he didn't take him off the drugs, he started fainting everywhere. And his blood thinning had come back to normal, and if he didn't stop the blood thinning medication, he started bleeding everywhere. Can you see what I'm saying? Because the drugs have no intelligence at all. They're just robots. Get out of my way. I've got a job to do, whether you need it or not, but not the herbs. The herbs work. What they do when they plaster your hand now, they do a two-part plaster because of the swelling. And that was great because I could just cut one off. I knew I had to immobilise it, that's common sense for it to heal. But I was able to put comfrey poultices on. And comfrey is a herb that has a growth stimulant. It stimulates rapid healing. In fact, its nickname is Nick Bone. So every day for a few hours I would put that on. I was talking to a lady recently and she said to her husband, remember the comfrey we had in the garden? It just took over? That's because it's got a growth stimulant. So don't put it in your veggie garden or you'll lose your veggie garden. It'll just take over. Put it somewhere where it doesn't matter if it takes over. Now at the moment, because of the snow and the cold, the leaves are gone, but all the healing properties are in the root. So if you need it in the winter, you dig up the root and grate it. Anyway, it was summer, so I put because we're still in summer in Australia. This is the last month of summer for us. So I put the comfrey on every day, and after 4 weeks, I went back to have an x-ray. Now when the orthopedic surgeon pulled it into place and plastered it, they did it. And he came to me, he said, look, it's pretty good. That was enough for me. I thought, pretty good's enough for me. That comfrey will take it the rest of the way, whatever pretty good meant. I think it meant that it was in line enough, but not perfect. So at 4 weeks, they wanted to x-ray it again just to check if it was all going right. And they were just so puzzled that this 70-year-old woman's bone was almost perfectly healed. At 4 weeks, now it takes 6 weeks to heal a bone, but this, and I know that was healed because I drink water, I eat nourishing food, I eat lots of minerals, I exercise every day, etc., etc. Anyway, so they wanted to replaster it just to be sure. And the male nurse was plastering it. He said, do you have osteoporosis? I said, no. He said, have you had a test? I said, no. And then I realised that sounds a bit strange, especially because of my age. And he threw his head back and he laughed. He never heard anything like it. How do I know I don't have osteoporosis? Well, when my body flew up in the air and slammed down on the rock with this hand underneath me, more than that hand would have broken. In fact, they kept saying to me, is your leg all right? Your hip all right? Is it? I said, yeah, fine. It's just, oh, there might have been something else, but I could feel nothing else that this had. And what was interesting is once it was pulled into place, I did not need any more painkillers. You see, that was telling me it needed more than a comfrey poultice at that stage. It was incredibly painful. But my husband went to the nurse when I'm sitting there in the most terrible pain after 5 hours and said, my wife, she's been sitting here for 5 hours, you know, look at her arm. And you know what they said? She's on the fast track. I'd hate to be on the slow track. Do you know, that's something to consider too, is little bits and pieces that you could deal with at home instead of sitting in that emergency waiting room. I don't know, they must have had people dying out the back to put me there. But these two methods of healing show us also very clearly, eraser.